So we're on learning outcome 3 for assessing learners in education and training. And this is quite a short one, you'll be happy to know, compared to our last two. There's only 2 points. And this is be able to implement the minimum core when assessing learners. So 3.1 is analyze ways in which minimum core elements can be demonstrated in assessing learners. And 3.2, apply minimum core in assessing learners. You'll notice there's a trend in all of these units. There's always a section on minimum core, section on reviewing yourself. So they do sort of, but obviously depending on what they're talking about, so it's assessing in this case. So, minimum core, as we've already gone over it a couple of times before, we know that minimum core covers English, maths, spelling, and information and communication technology. These minimum core skills are embedded within your teaching on a daily basis. So English, maths, ICT is something that we're on a daily basis within every 1 hour lessons. So on to 3.1. So analyze ways in which can be demonstrated in assessing learners. Now this cannot be referenced or cross-referenced to the previous ones because this is how we do it for assessments rather than how we do it to promote or develop our students' learning. So anybody that teaches or supports any students or has any learning or assessment processes, takes part in anything of that, should ideally be proficient in the minimum core skills. Now, there's a few ways of demonstrating these 4 minimum core skills, and that is literacy. You'll have had some of this already. Reading, writing, checking your spelling, grammar, punctuation, and so on. And then you're going to look at when you're assessing, you need to have an understanding of minimum core. So again, this minimum core is just focusing on functional skills like English, maths, and ICT. So it's important that you recognize how this is actually done. So if you've got poor literacy, poor numeracy, and poor ICT, this could cause a barrier in learning. So it's important that whichever teaching subject or anything that we're doing, even in assessments, that we actually promote minimum core, promote the English, maths, and IT within that, so that we can try and bring the level further up or adapt things so that our students can actually learn. We're also looking at the assessment methods. So the assessment methods can be a variety of things. And at the beginning of this year, you've been doing a few of them anyway. So things like observations, questioning, you can do written like exams, tests. You can do oral tests, speaking, listening. You might have a phonics checklist in front of you where you might say, show the student what the sounds are and say, can you read these out to me? Or flashcards, a whole lot of ways that we adapt it depending on our students. So we're also going to look at what the relationship of minimum core is to the areas that are being assessed. So when we're reviewing our learners' work, you need to comment on any errors, and we've already made a point of this, I think, in the last unit and the unit before. But you need to comment on any areas of spelling or errors that are happening for grammar and punctuation, and this will actually help them to understand where the shortcomings are, where the weaknesses are, or the areas of development that they've actually got to do, and actually know exactly what they need to do. Because you have to actually identify where the issue is before you can physically actually go and fix it. So it really helps your students when you put this out for them. Now, this will also just help you to demonstrate your own skills, but also help you to help your learners to improve. So you're improving yourself as well, because you're being quite stickler for little things. Because if you are pointing little things out, it's not because you're being mean or you're trying to pick on someone. It's because you want them to get a good, steady fashion of actually doing things in a certain way, so that as they go forward, they can continue with it. Now, there's a few things that when I'm marking assessments, I'll say to a lot of my students, so like, you've not done a contents page, or you've not put your references in, or you have put your references, but you've not done in-text referencing, or the fonts and the sizes on your assignment are different sizes, they're different colors, one's in italics, one's in bold, where it doesn't need to be, one's a size 10, one's a size 16. And that's not to point out to them that this or that or the other. It's just so that they know that in future assignments, they've got a particular standard they should be working on, make it uniform. So when they go into university, it'll help them to have an easier path. Then you've got ways of presenting completed assessments. I don't know why I was about to say complicated then. But the different ways that you can show your completed assessments are things like your assignments, things like when you're assessing written work, you've got practical work. If you're in like a science class or a apprenticeship sort of field, it might be laboratory work or field work or on work-based learning, like work placements. It might be where you're getting observed. You know, you might have reflective assessments so that for every single little thing you can't get observed for. So maybe you'll get asked a question and you'll be asked to write a reflective assessment to show your understanding. It could be done orally, it could be done through portfolios, either electronic or handwritten. So there's a whole load of ways that you can actually look at assessments, you know, completed assessments. So completed assessments aren't just the traditional exam and you send it off to get marks. There's so many different ways to do these things now. And then we get into mapping. So what is assessment mapping? Now, assessment mapping is just a process of when you're actually comparing each assessment part to another, say, unit. You're checking the competency of it. So, for example, how I would say for how it works for us, like there's a lot of things, a lot of points or assessment criteria that you've been able to cross-reference to other units. So that in a way is mapping. So you've not had to repeat some of the work because you can say, oh, please refer to Unit 1, LO3 for 3.2. And that is us essentially mapping your work so that you're not having to repeat your work. In primaries and in schools, it's just you looking at what you're assessing right now, and then you're looking at previous assessments that might have been done, like formative assessments, summative assessments. You might have, you know, observed somebody, or you might have a piece of homework of someone. So you're actually checking that what the point. So if you're trying to understand the students' math skills, what their proficiency is in maths, you're going to be looking at the homework and looking at the previous tests and cross-referencing it, aren't you? So that's what we would call mapping.
Okay.
So in a way, it's sort of like a holistic way. So you're really looking at every aspect of their learning rather than just that one piece of paper that's in front of you.
Okay.
So another 2 more slides on this. So considering reasonable adjustments. So sometimes when you're doing assessments, you do need to have reasonable adjustments put in place. Now, the purpose of these reasonable adjustments in assessment is to, so I'm just going to read through the best way to explain. So it's to help you to provide a framework in which the student can demonstrate learning, knowledge, understanding within their chosen area of study. It's also to help you to build resilience and develop skill sets that will equip the student into employment or further study. And then it's also there to facilitate completion of the course so that it's actually done in a timely manner with the best outcome possible for that student. And then what are reasonable adjustments? So what do we actually call them? So these are like just the steps that we take to make sure that your student isn't being disadvantaged because of, say, a disability or a language barrier, or if there's physically it might take them, if they have ADHD, sometimes information overload can be an issue. If they have dyslexia, they might need a little bit of extra time to actually just sit down and be able to complete their work. So in these circumstances, reasonable adjustments can happen. Or you might even have a student that's turned up and they broke their arm the night before and now they can't write down. They can't sit down and do a written test. So there's loads of different things that can happen. So are you okay with what we've talked about on all of this?
Yes.
Yeah, brilliant. So on here, for answering this, really, all you've got to do is make sure you include every point that we've talked about. So talk about, put information about how we address minimum core. How do we put it in with assessment? So just more or less the same way as you do when you're planning your teaching or planning, interventions or anything. How do you put minimum core into that? So talk about that. What is included in minimum core and how it's implemented. So you're talking about maths, English, spelling and grammar. You're talking about ICT, how it's put in there and how you actually implement it. Then just talk about the different assessment methods that you use and the different permitted ways of presenting completed assessments. So things like portfolios, physical laboratory type work, experiments. You might have video footage showing that a particular task has been covered out, or recordings. Then you might have mapping, and then you want to talk about reasonable adjustments as well. So this one's going to be a bit of a long one, but you're just going to make sure that you cover all those points in the slides above, and you'll be fine on that.
Okay.
So 3.2, which is apply minimum core elements in assessing learners. So again, quite similar, but now you're just applying it rather than talking about it. So when we're applying minimum core elements in assessing learners, we look at our planning. So we look at how we're going to plan our activities, what sort of assessments we're going to do, and how we're going to put minimum core into those. So in a simple way, when we're doing spellings, and I know I've said this a couple of times, when we're doing spellings, you've got your class of year 1 learners, and you say to them, right, today we're going to do 10 different words. We're going to spell them. In your spellings book, write me a list 1 to 10. Write me the numbers 1 to 10. So them physically writing a list of 1 to 10 so that they're ready for each word is you putting maths into that. Then them actually spell cloud. They're doing the ow sound. Then they're actually listening and they're doing their spelling. You've got English coming into it as well. And then if you're going to get everybody to mark it at the end, you might want to use your interactive whiteboard and put the spellings up one by one and say, right, who got this one correct? Let's mark it, and so on from there. So you got all 3 things embedded quite simply within one simple spelling test that probably took 20 minutes to do.
Okay.
Then you have to look at different opportunities. So where can you actually apply minimum core? So you don't just want to put something on the computer just for the sake of saying, oh, I did ICT today, or I had this on here. So you've got to make sure that you're doing it in a manner which befits what you're actually. So as long as it's appropriate. So if you're doing a termly test using a computer, you'll have ICT skills. A paper test, obviously you'll have things that are numbered or bullet pointed. You'll have spelling in there. You might have a little bit of maths through with the numbering of the questions and so on.
Okay.
Again. So again, with this, you're just cross-referencing and comparing skills. You're looking at mapping is also good for you to figure out what gaps there are in the student's learning as well. So if you realize, oh, okay, these points here are getting addressed and that's fine. But then you can also look at the points that haven't been addressed. There might be a generalization within the whole class and you're realizing, oh, they're quite good at shapes and 3D. But they're not that great at decimal points. So maybe that's something that I need to focus on because the whole class seems to be having a shortfall on that. So mapping is good to figure out what areas you need to do. So you're going to cross-reference and compare your skills. You're going to look at how you're going to actually plan to implement your minimum core within your teaching. So you might just want to assess speaking skills. You might want to have a conversation or a question and answer session. You might want to observe them with other members of staff or speaking to other students. You might even set up a group task. So I remember when I used to do guided reading, and I wanted to actually understand and assess what their competency was in understanding the subject that we just talked about in the previous lesson. I'd give them they'd all have the same book. And then I'd tell them, right, I want you to focus on this character or on this point. What happened when this character was doing this? You bring a set of questions, you bring a set of questions, you bring a set of questions. You all need 5 questions each, and you're going to ask each table. So what they would do is after 10 minutes, they've thought of those 5 questions each. There'd be 3 groups, and they'd ask each group 1 question at a time. That helped me understand if they actually understood what the lesson was about, if they're asking competent questions that actually focus on the topic that we looked at. And then the students that were answering, it showed, are they actually listening? Were they paying attention? Have they actually understood? Are they capable of giving us creative answers to creative questions? So it's nice, these group activities and conversations, they can be quite helpful for assessment.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have consistent application. And this is where you just got to make sure that you're consistent. That, you know, if you're doing a spelling test once a week, and one time you tell them to number their lines 1 to 10, the next time you're not bothered, or 3 weeks later you say, oh, okay, let's number them again, and then for another 4 weeks you don't bother. It doesn't give them consistency, and it's not you know, it's mishmash.
Yeah.
So be consistent and try and set up a routine, because children thrive on routine, especially in the younger days. They learn what is expected of them, and sometimes they preempt you and start doing it first. And then you've got documentation, so just make sure you've got everything documented properly. You might want to put in a USB, you might have it physical paper or saved in your Dropbox or cloud. But you just have your lesson plans, your schemes of work, your assessment techniques, what sort of different applications you want to do for a minimum core. Have like a core idea, a basic idea of what you want to do, you know, like a bank of ideas, and then you can sort of like go back into them and make things interesting. So that was 3.2, apply minimum core elements in assessing learners.
Mm-hmm.
So would you like to go over anything or ask any questions?
No.
Okay.
Just one thing, you know, 3.1 and 3.2 possibly looks similar, because that we are asking that analyze the ways, and when we are talking about analyzing, we are talking about how we are applying them.
Yeah, I think if you're analyzing it, so it's sort of like where you're talking about what has already happened. You're talking about, this is what I did, and this is my judgment now. So these are the things that I have done previously. Apply means you're doing it right now, you're doing it currently. So there you can, putting them together will probably mean a lot more work for you. So having them separate is better, because you're analyzing is sort of like a reflective way to start off with, and applying is what you're physically going to be doing as if you're doing it right now, telling me about it.
Okay.
To be honest, a lot of these points, especially these last 2 units that you've looked at, Unit 4 and Unit 3, a lot of these points will get covered when you do your observations.
Okay.
So if there's anything that's missing out of these answers, we'll most likely get them backed up with your observations on that.
Okay.
So on here, you just need to talk about how you're going to include this information when you're applying minimum core. So talk about how you put minimum core for assessments when you're planning, when you're looking at different opportunities for learning and assessments, when you're looking at mapping, when you're trying to, and how you're going to be consistent with it, with the application of this, and how you're going to document the work. So let me just come out of here.